The executive, Todd Peterson, watched me fumble with the gate pass. He chuckled, loud enough for the entire security line to turn. Some people just don't belong in these parts, do they? His eyes scanned my worn jacket, then landed on my face, a smirk solidifying. You're probably just lost. Stick to the bus, buddy. The guard behind the counter hesitated, looking at me with pity. The fluorescent lights of O'Hare Airport hummed, a constant low thrum against the distant announcements. Dale Miller stood in the first-class check-in line, his hands resting lightly on the handle of his carry-on. His plaid flannel shirt, though clean, showed the faint wear of many seasons, and his scuffed work boots were more suited to a construction site than a bustling airport terminal. The line moved slowly, a predictable rhythm of passports and boarding passes. A man, sharply dressed in a charcoal gray suit that hugged his shoulders just right, stepped up beside Dale in the parallel line. Todd Peterson carried a slim leather briefcase and a look of practiced impatience. His eyes, quick and assessing, swept over Dale, lingering on the worn fabric of his shirt, then his boots. A subtle tightening around Todd's mouth registered. He leaned in slightly, his voice a low, dismissive murmur. Looks like first class is really lowering its standards these days. You get lost on your way to economy, buddy? Dale turned his head slowly, meeting Todd's gaze. His expression remained unreadable. No, sir, he said, his voice quiet, steady. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Todd snorted, a short burst of air through his nose. He didn't bother to respond directly, instead turning his attention to the agent at the counter. As they both progressed through check-in, Todd continued to cast sidelong glances at Dale, a faint smirk playing on his lips, as if Dale's presence was a personal affront to the concept of first-class travel itself. Dale simply held his boarding pass, observing the efficiency of the agents, ignoring the man beside him. Later, walking down the jet bridge, the scent of jet fuel faint in the recycled air, Todd strode with an exaggerated confidence, clearly accustomed to the faster path to the plane. He pushed past a young woman with a laptop bag, muttering something about efficiency. When he finally reached his seat, a window seat on the left side of the cabin, he stopped short. Dale Miller was already settled in the aisle seat beside it, looking out at the ground crew. Todd let out a groan, loud enough for the couple in the row ahead to turn their heads. You've got to be kidding me, he exclaimed, shaking his head. Don't tell me I'm stuck next to you. Dale turned from the window, his gaze steady, devoid of any visible irritation. Looks like we're seatmates, he said, his voice even. I hope that's not a problem for you. Todd ignored the question. He squeezed past Dale, dropping heavily into the window seat. He adjusted his suit jacket, then buckled his seatbelt with an audible click, muttering under his breath. Paid good money for a little refinement. Guess they're just giving these seats away to anyone now. He didn't look at Dale when he spoke. Across the aisle, a woman with silver hair, her face lined with a kind sort of weariness, shot Todd a brief, disapproving look. Todd, however, was too preoccupied with his own indignation to notice. He pulled out a tablet from his briefcase, then put it away, clearly unable to settle. He finally turned to Dale, a forced casualness in his tone, though his eyes still held a sharp, probing quality. So what's your story? Win a contest or something? First time in first class? Dale offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. No, not my first time. I travel quite a bit for work. Todd barked a laugh, a sudden harsh sound that cut through the quiet hum of the cabin. Work? What kind of work has you dressed like that in flying first class? Professional dumpster diver? Dale's gaze didn't waver. His voice remained quiet, measured. It's not where you sit that defines you, but how you behave. Todd's face flushed, a mottled red spreading up his neck. He leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms over his chest. Oh, spare me the fortune cookie wisdom. I've worked hard for my success. You, I'm not so sure. Martha, the elderly passenger seated directly behind them, leaned forward slightly. Her voice, though soft, carried a surprising clarity. Young man, she said, addressing Todd directly, that gentleman looks far more dignified than you do. Expensive suit or not? Todd's head snapped around, his jaw tightening, ready to unleash another sharp retort at Martha. But his eyes, quick and darting, swept across the cabin. A dozen pairs of eyes, not angry, but collectively disapproving, met his. The woman 2 rows back shook her head subtly. He turned back slowly, a muscle twitching in his cheek, muttering something about unsolicited opinions, under his breath. He shifted in his seat, his gaze fixed on the seat back in front of him, though his shoulders remained stiff. The cabin air seemed to thicken, a quiet hum of disapproval settling over the first-class section. Even the flight attendants, usually all smiles and gentle inquiries, moved with a slight, almost imperceptible stiffness as they began the pre-flight safety checks. Their professional demeanor held firm, but their eyes, though observant, seemed to avoid Todd's particular row as they walked the aisle, checking seatbelts and tray tables. Passengers adjusted their pillows, unfolded newspapers, or simply stared straight ahead, a collective agreement to ignore the source of the recent tension. Soon, the drink service commenced. A flight attendant, a young woman with a neat ponytail, approached our row. Todd sat up straighter. When she asked for his order, he cleared his throat with a flourish, making sure his voice carried. "I'll have a glass of your finest, of course. The Dom Perignon, if you have it." He shot a pointed, almost theatrical look in my direction, as if daring me to match his extravagant choice. When she turned to me, I simply said, "Water, please." Todd couldn't resist. He leaned in, a sneer playing on his lips. "Water, come on, live a little. Oh, wait, I forgot. Simplicity is for those who can't afford luxury." The flight attendant's eyes, polite until that moment, widened almost imperceptibly. A sharp intake of breath, a distinct gasp came from the woman across the aisle. Even the quiet murmur of the cabin seemed to pause for a second. The flight attendant kept her composure, nodding stiffly. I just offered her a small, unperturbed smile. "Thank you for the water," I said. Todd, emboldened by my lack of reaction, pressed on. He clearly saw my calm as weakness. "So what exactly is it that you do anyway? Some small-time trade or craft, I imagine?" He gestured vaguely at my flannel shirt, as if it explained everything. I took a slow sip of the cold water, the plastic cup cool against my fingers. "I work in the film industry," I replied, setting the cup down on the small tray table. Todd barked a laugh, a dry, humorless sound. "Oh, I see. The film industry? What, low-budget commercials or something? Maybe industrial training videos for a factory in Toledo?" He leaned back, crossing his arms, a smug expression settling on his face, as if he had definitively placed me in a category he deemed inferior. Before I could offer any further explanation, a new voice, low and firm, cut through the cabin. Frank, Martha's husband, had been quietly observing from the row behind us. "Young man," Frank said, his tone carrying a surprising weight, "do you really not know who that is? That's Dale Miller." The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. The quiet hum of the cabin vanished. Every eye, it seemed, turned to Todd. His smug expression dissolved, replaced by a look of bewildered shock. The color drained from his face so rapidly I could almost see it happen. "Dale? Dale Miller?" Todd stammered, his voice thin and reedy. He looked at me, then back at Frank, then at me again, as if trying to reconcile the image of a Hollywood star with the man in the plaid shirt beside him. But that's impossible. Dale Miller is a Hollywood star. He couldn't. His voice trailed off, lost in his own disbelief. I felt a familiar wave of discomfort. The sudden focused attention was never something I sought. I shifted slightly in my seat, my gaze dropping to the water cup in my hand. "It's true," I confirmed softly, my voice just above a whisper. "I prefer to travel low-key when I can." Todd's mind seemed to seize up, his eyes wide and unfocused. He looked around the cabin, a desperate, frantic energy in his movements, as if searching for a hidden camera, a mischievous grin from a flight attendant, anything to suggest this was some elaborate joke. But there was no such relief. The faces looking back at him held a quiet reverence for me, a sudden, almost shy admiration, mixed with an unmistakable coldness directed solely at him. The polite murmurs of the cabin had entirely ceased. I didn't know," Todd stammered, his voice losing its earlier crispness, becoming thin and hesitant. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it slightly. "You have to understand the way you're dressed. I just assumed." His words trailed off, weak and unconvincing. leaving the unspoken prejudices hanging in the air. I cut him off, my voice still gentle but firm enough to carry. You assumed based on outward appearances, I said, looking him directly in the eye. And that's a dangerous thing to do. The soft glow of phone screens began to appear around the cabin. Not overtly, not shoved in faces, but subtle. A hand holding a device slightly higher, a lens pointed discreetly. The faint shimmer of recording lights, unseen by Todd but noted by me. It was the modern way of public accounting, silent and pervasive. Realization seemed to hit Todd like a physical blow. The weight of his public gaffes, now amplified by my identity, settled heavily on him. His face, already pale, took on an almost greenish tint. He pushed himself slightly out of his seat, his voice rising, edged with panic. "This isn't fair," he shouted, louder than anyone else in the cabin. "You're all ganging up on me. How was I supposed to know? It's a setup. That's what it is?" His eyes were wild, darting from face to face, seeking an ally that wasn't there. From across the aisle, Carol, the middle-aged woman with the silver hair, could no longer hold back. Her voice, though not a shout, carried a surprising force. "The only one who set you up was yourself, you pompous windbag," she declared, her eyes flashing. "You've been nothing but rude and condescending since you got on this plane." Todd's head whipped around, his face reddening with a new surge of rage. He pointed a trembling finger at Carol. "Mind your own business, you nosy busybody." My own voice, still calm, cut through the escalating exchange. But this time it held an edge of steel, a quiet authority that demanded attention. "That's quite enough," I said, my gaze sweeping from Todd to Carol and then back to Todd. "Sir, I think it's best if we all take a deep breath and remember where we are." The cabin fell utterly silent once more. The air, thick with tension only moments before, now felt thin, stretched. Every single eye in first class was fixed on me. Even Todd, his face a blotchy red, panting slightly from his outburst, seemed to deflate under my steady, unwavering gaze. His shoulders sagged, his outstretched fingers slowly lowering. "Look," I continued, my voice returning to its softer, more measured tone. "Mistakes happen. We all make judgments we shouldn't. It's part of being human." I paused, allowing the words to settle. But how we handle those mistakes, how we treat others, especially when we're wrong, that's what reveals our true character. Todd sank back into his seat, the fight completely gone out of him. He stared straight ahead, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, looking small and defeated. Around the cabin, I saw subtle nods of agreement. A few passengers offered small, approving smiles. No one spoke. True to form, I offered no further comment, no gloating. The point had been made. The lesson, if Todd was willing to learn it, had been delivered. I simply reached for the book I'd set aside earlier, opened it to my place, and returned to its quiet pages, leaving the rest of the cabin to process the uncomfortable truth. For the remainder of the flight, Todd Peterson remained uncharacteristically quiet. He stared out the window, occasionally shifting in his seat, but his earlier bluster had evaporated completely. The set of his shoulders, once so rigid with self-importance, now conveyed a profound, almost palpable embarrassment. He barely moved, a statue carved from mortified silence, occasionally glancing down at his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Meanwhile, the cabin's atmosphere slowly began to shift. The palpable tension, once thick and uncomfortable, gave way to a subdued, almost reflective mood. Emboldened by my quiet demeanor, a few passengers, mostly those who had witnessed the exchange, worked up the courage to approach. A man from a few rows back leaned over, asking about a film project I'd worked on years ago. I exchanged pleasantries, discussing the challenges of shooting on location in winter, my voice low and even. Just another traveler making conversation. Martha, Frank's wife, offered a small, kind smile. Later, a flight attendant, the same one Todd had been rude to earlier, stopped by my seat. She held out a fresh bottle of water. "Another one for you, Mr. Miller," she said, her smile subtle and knowing, her eyes holding a gentle acknowledgement of the quiet dignity I'd maintained. I thanked her, the simple exchange a quiet confirmation of the collective sentiment in the cabin. From the corner of his eye, Todd watched. I could feel his gaze, a weight I'd grown accustomed to over the years. He watched as I interacted with the others, observed the genuine respect and quiet admiration that came my way, not because of a display of wealth or status, but simply for being approachable, for being myself. My unassuming, comfortable nature stood in stark contrast to his earlier, desperate display of bravado, a fact that seemed to etch itself deeper into his consciousness with every passing minute. I could almost see the full weight of his actions settling upon him. A heavy, cold knot, I imagine, was forming somewhere in his stomach, tightening with each memory of his harsh words. He glanced down at his expensive suit, the charcoal gray fabric that had once felt like armor, a declaration of his success. Now, under the fluorescent cabin lights, it seemed less like protection and more like a costume, inviting judgment rather than respect. He caught snippets of whispered conversations from behind him, soft murmurs about the incident, about that man and his behavior. The words were like tiny daggers to his ego, each one confirming the extent of his public humiliation. He flinched slightly, pulling his shoulders inward as if to make himself smaller, less visible. A young woman, barely out of college, approached with a small notebook in a trembling hand. "Mr. Miller," she whispered, "could I possibly trouble you for an autograph?" I took the pen, signed my name neatly, adding a quick, "Nice to meet you," never letting the small interruption disrupt the quiet presence I held. A quick selfie request followed from a business traveler, which I also accommodated with a calm nod, then returned to my book. Todd, I knew, considered apologizing. I could feel the moment of indecision, the slight shift in his posture, the almost imperceptible opening of his mouth. But the words wouldn't form. They were choked, I suspected, by a potent mix of shame and a burgeoning fear of what awaited him once he stepped off this plane. The quiet, contained world of the first-class cabin was nearing its end. The plane began its descent. The engines whined, the cabin pressure subtly shifted, and the familiar landmarks of the Chicago skyline started to appear below. Todd's mind, I could tell, was racing, no longer solely focused on the present moment, but already imagining the implications of what had just transpired for his carefully constructed reputation, his future business dealings, his carefully cultivated image. The seatbelt sign dinged off with a final, almost ominous chime, signaling not just the end of the flight, but the end of his brief, protected reprieve. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, the reverse thrust roaring for a moment before settling into a steady taxi. The familiar chime announced the safe arrival, but for Todd, it was an alarm bell signaling the beginning of something far less pleasant. Even before the wheels had fully stopped, I knew. The subtle buzz of notifications, the quick, knowing glances among passengers who had been recording. The incident was no longer confined to the cabin. Videos, short clips of his outbursts, his condescension, were already spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. Todd's face, his name, the precise details of his humiliation were being plastered all over the internet, immortalized for the world to see and judge. Todd remained frozen in his seat, his seatbelt still buckled, even as others began to unfasten theirs. His mind, I could tell, was racing, caught in a crushing loop of what if and what now. The weight of what had just happened, the instantaneous nature of modern shame, pressed down on him. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers boring into him, their collective judgment a palpable force in the recycled air of the cabin, colder and more cutting than any spoken word. I, ever the gentleman, simply stood up. I reached for my worn canvas backpack in the overhead compartment, retrieved it with an easy practice motion. As I moved, gathering my belongings, Todd couldn't help but notice the quiet strength in my movements, the unhurried grace that spoke of a man utterly comfortable in his own skin, at peace with his place in the world. It contrasted sharply with Todd's own rigid posture, his body language screaming discomfort and shame, every muscle tensed in anticipation of a reckoning. I don't know what to pay," Todd mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper, choked by the sudden collapse of his world. He didn't look up, instead staring at the polished buckle of his seatbelt. I paused, looking down at the businessman from my slightly elevated position. There was a mixture of pity and understanding in my gaze, not a trace of gloating. Sometimes I said softly, my voice quiet enough that only he could hear. It's better to say nothing at all. Actions speak louder than words, after all. With that, I tightened the strap of my backpack and made my way down the aisle, leaving Todd to grapple with the wreckage of his reputation, alone in his expensive seat. As I passed, other passengers stood up, some offering quiet applause, a few reaching out to shake my hand or asking for a quick selfie, their faces lit with genuine admiration. I obliged with grace, my gentle smile a balm to the tension that had permeated the cabin, dissolving it into a collective sense of shared experience, of right being affirmed. Todd watched this procession with a growing sense of dread, seeing his own downfall unfold in real time. In the respectful nods, the quiet smiles, the whispered thanks directed at me. He had spent years cultivating an image of success and superiority, a meticulously constructed facade designed to command respect and distance him from what he considered the common man. And in the span of a single flight, it had all come crashing down, exposed not by a rival, but by his own unthinking cruelty and the silent judgment of strangers. It was a costly choice, and sometimes life's most profound lessons come with the highest price. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. Todd Peterson finally managed to unbuckle his seatbelt, the clicks sounding unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet cabin. His movements were stiff, his hands fumbling slightly as he reached up for his sleek designer carry-on in the overhead bin. Each action felt slow, deliberate, a painful performance under the unseen gaze of his fellow passengers. He slung the bag over his shoulder, the weight of it suddenly unfamiliar. As he shuffled down the narrow aisle, the whispers began, soft but clear enough to pierce the haze of his shame. "Can you believe that guy?" a woman murmured to her husband. "What a jerk," someone else snickered, just loud enough. "I bet he's not even really rich, probably just pretending." Each comment, each hushed judgment felt like a tiny, precise dagger twisting in his ego, piercing the brittle facade of his self-importance. He tried to make himself small, his head bowed, his gaze fixed on the dirty carpet, hoping to simply disappear, to melt into the stream of departing travelers. But there was no escaping it. The looks of contempt, the undisguised disgust, followed him every step of the way, a cold, unwavering spotlight on his humiliation. He pushed through the heavy glass doors of the jet bridge, blinking in the brighter terminal lights. The familiar bustle of O'Hare, usually a comforting backdrop to his travels, now felt like a stage set for his personal reckoning. And then he saw it, a scene that made his blood run cold, stopping him in his tracks. A small crowd had gathered just beyond the gate, a knot of people, many with phones raised, pointed, clearly waiting for someone. For him. In the center of it all, a beacon of calm in the swirling chaos, stood Dale Miller. He was signing autographs, chatting amiably with Holmes, his gentle smile radiating an easy warmth. The stark contrast between my serene composure and Todd's rising panic was almost unbearable. The moment Todd appeared, hesitant and hunched at the mouth of the jet bridge, a hush fell over the crowd. It was a momentary silence, profound and ominous, before the storm. Then, like a dam bursting, the questions and accusations began to fly, a furious verbal onslaught. "Hey, aren't you the guy who was mean to Dale Miller?" a young man shouted, thrusting a phone with a recording towards Todd's face. Another voice, sharp and cutting, followed immediately. "How does it feel to be the most hated man on the internet right now?" Todd was overwhelmed. He stood there frozen, unable to respond, facing the full, brutal force of public scorn. The words tangled in his throat, his mind blank with terror. The full realization of his mistake, his arrogance, and the irreversible damage to his carefully constructed life hit him with a sickening clarity. His reputation, his career, his very identity, meticulously built over years, had been shattered in the span of a single plane ride. From within the admiring crowd, I caught Todd's eye. I offered no word, no gesture of triumph, just a subtle, knowing glance. It was a silent testament to the enduring moral consequences of his actions, a confirmation that some lessons, once learned, cannot be unlearned. Todd was left utterly alone in the bustling terminal, exposed and adrift, grappling with the profound public price of his actions. He was no longer just the man in the expensive suit. He was the man who had been mean to Dale Miller. And that, he knew, would stick. Todd Peterson stood in the bustling terminal, the cacophony of travelers and announcements, a dull roar around him. The crowd had dispersed, drawn away by the genuine magnetism of Dale Miller, who was now a smaller figure in the distance, still surrounded by a few lingering admirers. Todd was left alone, physically present but utterly isolated, the echoes of the accusations still ringing in his ears. The realization settled over him, cold and heavy. This wasn't a bad business deal he could spin or a mistake he could charm his way out of. This was a public record, a digital stain on his meticulously crafted image. He reached instinctively for his phone, then stopped, his fingers hovering. What was the point? The damage was already done, spreading faster than he could comprehend. He looked around at the indifferent faces of passers-by, each one a potential witness, a potential judge. His expensive suit, once a symbol of power, now felt like a uniform of his folly. The price of his arrogance, it seemed, was to be paid in full view of the world, with no one to offer solace, and no way to escape the quiet, persistent shame.